Hello and welcome to Jackson's Job. Today you will learn how to roll out pastry dough, place it in a pie pan, create some easy but lovely borders, parbake, and blind bake. It sounds like a lot to learn, but it's really simple. First, let's go over how to roll out the pastry. You need to start with a slightly chilled dough. You don't want it to be too cold or it's going to be like a rock, but too warm and it will start sticking to everything and flaking away. So bring that dough out a little ahead of time, about 30 to 60 minutes. The dough will be ready when it gives away with pressure. If the dough is still too hard and not pliable at all, you need to wait just a little longer. When it comes to rolling out the dough, you have quite a few options. We will show you the two most common methods. My favorite method is this one. You start out with a well-floured surface, about a tablespoon or 9 grams or so of flour, and then you place the rolling pin in the center of the dough and roll up. Never roll over the edge, just up to the edge. You then turn the dough a quarter of a turn, start in the center and roll up. You repeat this process over and over until you get the size you want. This creates a lovely circle of pastry quite quickly. With the second method, you place the rolling pin in either the center of the dough or at the edge. Roll up, roll down. Your dough becomes oblong shaped. You now turn the dough a half of a turn and repeat the process. Roll up, roll down. This time your dough becomes more rounded. You continue this until you get the size you need. This method is more prone to cracking and tearing and is sometimes difficult to maintain a nice round shape. We aren't a fan, but it's what you are most comfortable with using. Whichever method you use, the dough will start to crack. Cracking along the edges should occur as you are working with short crust pastry. It's a good sign it's not overworked. Stop and patch these cracks by pressing the edges back together with your fingers. However, if you start seeing excessive cracking, especially in the center, this is a sign your dough is too cold. Likewise, if you find you have to really press down on your dough to get it to roll out, it's too cold. With this next piece of pastry, we are going to slow things down, and we'll also show you how to correct problems if the dough is too cold. Sprinkle flour all over. Use as much as you need to begin and work your way down as you get better. Sprinkle the dough, the rolling pin, your hands, whatever it takes to make you feel comfortable. You are not going to make your pie shell tough or chewy with lots of flour like you sometimes read online or see in videos. This will not happen with a good recipe. If you need a good recipe, I'll include some below. See what I did there? If you made your own dough, it will sometimes be wet when you unwrap it. This is because moisture was drawn out of the dough as it rested. Just brush a little flour on top of the dough to absorb that dampness. This is another good reason to be generous with your flour when first starting out. I'm going to be working with a dough that's a little too cold on purpose to show you how you can push through and carry on when things go awry. If you see tiny cracks forming along their edges, don't fret. I told you these are normal, just press them back together with your hands. However, if you start to see a lot of cracks forming around the edges or even in the center, repair these and flip over your dough. Look at all the cracks hiding there as well. Make sure you repair these. This is a sign your dough is a little too cold. You can stop and wait for the dough to warm up, or you can press on. Let's press on and try the tapping method. When your dough is a little too cold, you can try to tap the dough and make it more pliable. You want to lightly tap the dough with a rolling pin. This softens the dough and flattens out the surface a bit along the way. Start at the top, tap all the way down in lines. Turn your dough a half a turn. Tap some more. Repair any cracks, flip the tap side over, and begin rolling your dough once more. Be careful not to wrap your knuckles while tapping. It hurts a lot. Conversely, if the dough is sticking excessively to your rolling pin or counter and it's flaking off, this is a sign your dough is too warm. You want to stop if this happens and chill it back down. Put it on a plate, cover it for about 15 minutes or so until it firms up to a more workable dough. This is a lot like the Robert Southey story about finding what's just right. Bonus points if you know the name. Another good tip is to have a spatula lying around. This will help you turn the dough as it gets larger, and it also helps loosen the dough if it ever starts sticking to the counter. It's a really good tool to have, and it's cheap. Everybody usually has one of these. If it does start to stick to the counter, make sure you add more flour. Now let's talk about the size and thickness of the crust. Having 3 inches or 7.5 centimeters of extra dough rolled out is a very good guideline. For example, I have a 9-inch or 23 centimeter pie pan. So I want to have a 12-inch or 30 centimeter circle of dough to work with while shaping. This excess of dough will allow you to have plenty of room for most deep dish pie shells, create many pretty borders, and have a little extra room for patching. For the thickness of pastry, I suggest you go for 1/8 of an inch or 3 millimeters. This is a great thickness for most pie recipes. You can always adjust up and adjust down to your liking. I actually like it a little bit thinner, but most beginners struggle with that, so I recommend Go up to even 1/4 of an inch if you're having trouble. That's 6 millimeters. Work your way down. The thinner the dough, the more prone it becomes to tearing. There are many ways to get your pastry dough into the pan. Some like to fold the dough into quarters, but I've found some short crust pastry recipes will split and crack along the folds. My favorite way is the old-fashioned method. Use your rolling pin. You start at the edge of the pastry and you roll it up. If it starts to crack, stop and repair it. If it's sticking to the pin, this is a sign the pastry is getting too warm. If you are having no issues, gently lay the dough on the edge of the pie pan and slowly unroll the dough. If your pie pan is sliding around, place a towel or even a silicone mat under it to get traction. Now, using your knuckles, lift the edges of the pastry with one hand and gently nestle the dough into the shape of the bakeware. Using your knuckles instead of your fingers prevents your fingernails from poking through or tearing the pastry. If you do tear it, just patch it back together. No one is going to be inspecting the bottom of your pie for flaws. Well, unless you're on a baking show or have that quirky friend. What are we going to do with all this extra pastry that's hanging over? We are going to make some edges. For this first one, we're going to use all the excess because we're going to make a deep dish pie shell. We do this by folding the dough over toward the outside of the pan. We want to fold it so the excess dough is caught only slightly inside the pie pan itself. As I turn the pan, you'll see how it's tucked in just a bit. While working with the pastry, it will start to show cracks. Depending on the type of pastry you used, it will be more prone to cracking and tearing as you work. Don't worry, just pinch the cracks and tears back together with your fingers as you go. As you are tucking in the pastry, it should start to want to stand up. If it starts to fold over, just press it between your fingers until it's standing tall. Once the dough is all nicely folded over and upright, we can use the pie shell just like this. It would be quite nice. But today we are going to create a large chunky fluted edge. The size will depend on the size of your fingers. Let me see if I can remember how to do this. Nope, no. Oh yeah. Using your knuckle from the outside and your index finger and thumb from the inside, you will create a little indentation. You want to create an O shape with your thumb and forefinger. And then you want to press the dough into that space with your opposing hand using your knuckle. The O shape should be wide enough to fit your knuckle. The smaller the O shape, the smaller the indent will be. We are going to really exaggerate this so you can see it in action. Watch closely. Hopefully between the explanation and the video you can understand this method. It just takes some practice. I'm a little out of shape due to this arm injury, so it'll be really interesting to see what I come up with. So what do you think? Do you think you can do this? I really think you can. And if you're anything at all like Emma that's a regular viewer, you're going to take it up a notch and make it really lovely. It only takes practice, so don't worry if it is a little bit wonky in the end like mine is. The important part is you made it and it's going to be delicious. There's nothing quite like a homemade pie shell. You now have a fancy looking deep dish pie shell. You also gain quite a bit of height. Isn't that cool? We will make more edges for those that want to stick around, but first, let's move forward a bit and prepare this for baking. You want to carefully cover the dough with plastic wrap or a thin clean towel in order not to break those edges you just made. You need to chill this dough down a bit. This does two things. It lets those glutens relax and chills the butter down. This will help reduce shrinkage, slippage, and more importantly, no more tough or greasy pies with just a simple step. After you've chilled the pastry, use a sheet pan to move the pie shell in and out of the oven. This will protect the edges and they won't get broken by handling them. It's also great for filled pies as it will catch any bubbling over berry compotes or sloshing around custards. Next, you may want to prick holes in the crust. This will help release steam and prevents bubbles from forming and staying there. Bubbles will still likely happen, but now they have a way to deflate. We now want to blind bake the pie shell. It's called blind baking because you won't be able to see the crust as it bakes. Well, at least I think. Blind baking, just like pricking the dough, helps the pastry keep its shape while it bakes. Because of all the butter and water, it will want to puff up and separate those layers. This can cause the pie shell to shift and bubble up in the oven. Blind baking also helps the pastry bake thoroughly without excessive browning. Some people will tell you to line the pie shell with plastic wrap. Do not do that. Melted plastic lets off toxic and horrible fumes. It is not intended to be baked. Instead, use aluminum foil or parchment to line the pan. I like to use aluminum foil because it's non-conductive and usually cool to the touch. Many parchment papers are not rated for higher temperatures. Using them at higher temperatures can cause the paper to catch. Also, the aluminum foil seems to mold better to the crust. This is especially important as it hides those edges which tends to get brown, sometimes with just using parchment. I always use 2 sheets of aluminum foil and stagger them. That way it fully covers the crust. There is an important note on chilling. Today's glassware isn't the same as it used to be. The glass often found today has a very small window of temperature swings it can handle. Beyond that, your glassware is prone to splitting, cracking, breaking, shattering, and even exploding. So if you do have a glass pie pan, just play it safe. Simply bring it back to room temperature before putting it in a hot oven. So what do we want to put inside? Truthfully, it doesn't always have to be weighted down, especially if you prick the dough or starting with cool pastry and the edges are sloped. However, weighing it down teaches the pie what shape you want it to be. What can you use for weights? There are expensive pie weights, but I don't care to spend money for that. Do you? Use what you have on hand. Beans, rice, flour, dried pasta, even sugar works great. Now for baking times. If you are baking a pie without any added sugar or browning agents such as baking soda, you would want to choose a higher temperature and bake it quicker. However, if you're using a sweet pastry, which has egg and sugar in it, it's very fragile to the heat. I would recommend going lower and slower. And when in doubt, always go lower. Which would you rather deal with, a burnt crust or a crust that takes longer to bake? We will include the fast and furious baking method in the notes for you wanting to live on the edge. In the meantime, let's turn that dial to 350 degrees Fahrenheit or 180 degrees Celsius. You want to blind bake at a moderate heat for 20 to 25 minutes, remove the weights, and then bake a little more. We have blind baked this crust for a while and now we need to take it from the oven. Even though the aluminum foil is not hot to the touch in general, the ingredients could be depending on what you used, especially sugar. Plus there could be some hot butter and steam under that foil waiting to escape. So use oven-safe gloves if you are at all concerned. Congratulations, you just par-baked a crust. If your recipe calls for that, you're now ready to move on. If not, we continue baking. You want to bake it approximately 10 to 20 more minutes or until it's the shade of golden brown you're looking for in your pie shell. The minimum time should dry out and finish baking most crust without much coloring. This will vary slightly due to the thickness and how accurate your oven holds heat. A general guideline is to just peek in every 5 minutes and rotate your crust. How long you want to bake comes down to a couple things. Are you putting instant pudding or no bake into the pie shell? Go ahead and get that crust a nice golden brown that you would want to eat. In contrast, is this going to go back in the oven to make a custard pumpkin or buttermilk pie? You just want to barely get a hint of color. For those kinds of recipes, it's more about thoroughly baking the crust, not browning it. And that's all there is to baking a pie shell. That wasn't so hard, was it? Now if you're interested, let's get back to those decorative edges. We'll do some simple but pretty ones. We will start out with an easy edge. The first thing we need to do with all these edges is trim off the excess dough, but not all of it. What I like to do is measure the lip or the edge of the pan. Do you have a 1/2 inch or a 1.27 centimeter lip? Go out the same distance from that edge and trim off any excess beyond that amount. As we did before, we're going to fold over the dough, but this time we want the dough to be flush with the edge of the pan. So we are going to lift up and fold the dough over toward the outside edge of the pan so that the excess meets the top lip. Once you have it completely folded over, lay the dough carefully onto the edge. Press the dough and repair any cracks or tears that form with your fingers and smooth them out. Okay, my friends, we are almost finished with our pastry series. Hasn't this been fun? Regardless of this answer, we will be completing our series with a lovely buttermilk pie. I think you'll like how simple it is to make, along with how you can customize it and call it your own. So if you want to learn how to make that, maybe you'll want to subscribe and turn on that little notification bell. If not, that's okay too. What do you do with all the scraps? Well, I like to toss them into a freezer bag. Once I get a big handful of them, I'll make another pie shell, or even better, I'll make cookies. Especially if it was sweet short crust pastry. I'll tell you a secret though. Sometimes I will microwave the dough at half power on each side for 6 seconds. That way I can work with it straight from the fridge. It's a very risky move as it can melt the butter completely, so do this one at your own peril. And that's it. This is called a folded flat edge, a folded edge, or just a flat edge. Pretty simple, right? And it looks really nice. Now let's make a forked edge. This is a very simple design. After you've made your folded edge, you take a fork and press the tines into the border. Work your way around the circumference of the pan. It gives a lovely crimped border like that 80s hairstyle. Wasn't that easy? And it looks pretty rad too. Finally, we're going to do a fluted edge once more, but this time using the tips of our fingers. You'll want shorter nails for this step to avoid tearing the pastry. With your index and thumb, press them together at the tips. Your knuckle will be rounded on your index finger. Press your first knuckle joint flat. See how it's now creating a little V shape? That's exactly what you want. You will be pressing the dough into this little V shape with your opposing index finger. This motion will create the border. Holding the V on the inside edge of the pie pan where the dough is laying flat, take your index finger and press the outside edge of the dough inward. Move your fingers over slightly and let your index finger of the V shape cradle the groove you just made. Work your way around the pie doing this motion. Let me see if I can show you this up close. Does this help at all? It really just takes practice to learn how to make this border. Doesn't this just look lovely? I think it's gorgeous. At the very end, you just want them to connect. You may need to adjust your fingers a little bit smaller or wider. It will look pretty nice. It was a pleasure chatting with you today. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial as much as we enjoyed making it for you. Thank you for watching, and as always, happy baking.